Welcome, folks. We'll give people a couple minutes to trickle in and then we'll get started. We'll give folks one more minute to trickle in. All right, well, I'm seeing the attendees tick up, so let's just get started. Welcome, folks, to a webinar today where we'll cover policy principles to enable virtual power plants. And I'm Avery McAvoy. I'm a senior associate on the carbon-free electricity team. I help run the virtual power plant partnership at RMI, and I'm our regulatory and policy lead as well. So I'm looking forward to chatting through this with all of you today. So the objectives of today's webinar, it's a pretty meaty topic, so I'm looking forward to discussing with all of you. We'll share an overview of the policy principles that were recently published at the end of February by the Virtual Power Plant Partnership. We'll discuss how regulators and policymakers can leverage these principles in their work to achieve affordability, reliability, and decarbonization outcomes. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So the agenda to serve that, we'll hear some opening remarks from Ted Thomas. I'll give a presentation, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. The way to submit your Q&A, at the bottom of your screen, you can see there's a little Q&A function. So if you submit it there, I'll be able to see your questions. In terms of logistics, slides in this recording will be posted to RMI's website. We do invite you to use the Q&A function, and we can address them live during the second half of the webinar. And these slides will be posted. We'll share links to resources in the chat as well. So if you have any requests, please let us know. We're happy to share that. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So as we know, the energy transition is happening, and the energy system that we have is finite, it's physics-based, and it requires constant balancing of supply and demand. The past energy paradigm used to be one of centralized generation. It was power plant to transmission to distribution to end use, but we know that distributed energy resource penetrations are increasing. People are adopting electric vehicles. People have solar arrays on their homes and businesses. They're starting to adopt batteries. People are having smart thermostats and allowing companies to toggle their usage. People are converting to induction stoves and electric heat pumps. And the energy system is evolving, but the coordination and pace needs to increase. Harnessing distributed energy resources and locking virtual power plants, which I'll define in the later slides, is critical to enable the flexibility and affordability and reliability that our energy system needs as these different devices are coming online. So we see efforts to work on this coordination and integrate these demand-side solutions, but not necessarily at scale yet in the US. So the goal of these principles today is to outline these sets of guidance to help us in this scalable transition and how to bring it beyond pilot to long-term pathways. So with that, I'll hand it over to a few opening remarks from Ted Thomas.
Thank you, Avery. I approached my role as a utility regulator primarily as a risk manager. This is similar to the role of a manager of a retirement portfolio on behalf of beneficiaries. You manage the risk related to the assets owned by the utility for the benefit of its customers. A key risk is because of the fact that generation often is a 30 to 40-year lifetime. This creates risk because the value proposition can change in decades. And if you get it wrong, there are profoundly negative consequences. I estimated that about half of my ratepayers struggle to pay their bill. For as many as a third is a very difficult struggle. Public service is about making things better, harming people or barely making it. This is why risk management is so important. There's three key risks: price fluctuation, particularly the price of natural gas. State and federal policy can change and impacting the value of assets that have already been acquired, and technology can change, which is potentially a benefit, but also carries early adopter risk. A regulator must manage changing prices, changing policy, and changing technology. Portfolio diversification and innovation are perhaps the best risk management tools, and today we'll focus on innovation. We see innovation as a cost mitigator in the history of Clean Air Act regulation. The initial forecasts involve current prices and current technology. In reality, because of innovation, scaling of new technologies, and market-based emissions trading programs, actual costs were much less than the initial forecast cost. The regulator should also think about why innovation, seemingly supported by everybody, uh, can be so difficult. An examination of a quote by Jack Valenti will explain this. Valenti was a World War II bomber pilot. He was Harvard educated. He was a senior staffer in Lyndon Johnson's term, and who's actually on the plane that flew Johnson back to D.C. After the Kennedy assassination. Later, he was the lobbyist for the Motion Picture Association, and for decades was known as one of the most influential people in Washington, D.C. Jack Valenti said this at a congressional hearing. I say to you that the VCR is to the American film producer and the American public as the Boston Strangler is to a woman who is home alone. This quote demonstrates that when businesses are threatened by innovation, sometimes two things might happen. First, the interest of the consumer will be invoked to oppose innovation. And second, the innovator might get compared to a serial killer. Valenti's view does not stand the test of time. Broadcasting started with the radio, then they added pictures, and then color. There were three networks. Then there was cable that allowed more channels. Then there was the VCR, the DVD, and then streaming. What did the consumer want? To set their own schedule. The VCR was an important incremental step, not a threat to the public. Some innovations are incremental, some are more disruptive. Innovation is not a one and done proposition. A culture of innovation where the disruptor can then become the disrupted should be the end goal. And energy regulators should think about all potential innovations and think about what policy changes might be necessary should that technology or business practice emerge as one of the new technologies that will scale. Storage, carbon capture, offshore wind, biomass, geothermal, solar inverter technology. You should be thinking about everything. Today, we'll focus on DER, particularly DER aggregated into a VPP. Why DER? There are lots of consumers, which helps create a market. DER also allows customers to voluntarily manage their own risk in the way that they see fit instead of depending on someone else to manage it for him. Shorter life cycles in a 40-year gas plant is another reason that DER offers potential with innovation. And in fact, apps and software have life cycles that are much shorter in areas that we see rapid innovation. But we should also always remember that in energy, if it doesn't scale, it didn't happen. This is why we aggregate small DERs into large VPPs. The VPP policy principles that we presented today serve as a catalog of things that regulators should be thinking about to create a culture of innovation in technology and business practices related to distributed technologies. How do you scale DERs into VPPs in a technologically neutral and transparent manner? How do you provide market access to retail and wholesale level so that VPPs are enabled to provide all of the grid services that they're capable of providing? How do you measure what is provided in a transparent manner so that you know that it is actually delivered? How do you make sure your regulatory framework keeps pace with technological changes? How should VPPs be incorporated into utility planning processes? How do you compensate VPPs for the value provided with respect to resiliency, reliability, and sustainability? How do you find the ideal customer experience with respect to VPPs? and how are VPPs integrated into the utility system operations? These are some of the key questions that the report addresses and that we will discuss today. I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted, for those opening remarks. And I really value your perspective as a former regulator yourself. So thank you for being here today and help frame the conversation. So with that introduction, let's get into the content. As Ted mentioned, VPPs can be part of the regulator and policymaker toolkit. We all want to achieve the same outcomes of affordability, reliability, safety, and decarbonization. And we want to protect the grid and its customers in the process while delivering these benefits and harnessing everything that innovation can bring. So these policy principles will serve as a guide for the core set of conditions to enable VPPs to fairly compete in the energy industry, to deliver grid services, to provide energy and non-energy benefits to customers, and support the above objectives. So we want this to be part of the toolkit, and this is to guide for how to leverage them. There are a key set of conditions in order for them to be enabled, but we will get into that. For more, here are the policy principles, and one of my colleagues will send a link to that insight brief as well in the chat. So just to start us off, I want to level set with how we define a virtual power plant. We define a virtual power plant as an aggregation of grid-integrated distributed energy resources that can balance electrical loads and provide utility scale and utility grid services. The term virtual power plant can sometimes be a little jargony or seem like it's new, but it's really not. I view it as an integrated repackaging of familiar terms such as demand response, demand distributed energy resources, demand flexibility, energy efficiency. It's a repackaging of all of the things that are familiar, but you're just aggregating it all together and having it dynamically interact with the grid now that you have resources that are behind the meter and customer sited. Examples of distributed energy resources, as I mentioned, can be plug loads, it can be rooftop solar, it could be washers and dryers even. It really just depends on the program. So we purposefully define virtual power plants to be broad and inclusive. And why we're here today is that the market for them is absolutely growing and these loads are coming online. And we want to make sure that we're enabling the policy and regulation and frameworks and structures to be able to leverage all of the benefits that they can provide. So this graph that you can see here from Wood Mackenzie estimates that between 2022 and 2027, the market for distributed energy resources, these assets that are rolled up into these virtual power plant programs, they will double, representing about 262 gigawatts of capacity. And my frame of reference for this is a nuclear plant is about 1 gigawatt of capacity. So that is a lot of capacity on the grid available to help support some of the outcomes and objectives that regulators, policymakers, and technology providers all share. So this nearly matches the expected 272 gigawatts of utility scale resources to be installed over the same period of time. So this is demonstrating that utility scale resources used to be our main source of capacity and generation on all these different grid services. But by 2027, about the same amount is going to be available on the distributed demand side from customer-sided devices. So we need to scale programs that can unlock these benefits since these loads are coming online. VPPs can deliver a wide set of benefits. I mentioned energy benefits and non-energy benefits. This is taken from the Department of Energy's Pathways to Commercial Liftoff report that they published last October on virtual power plants. And VPPs can provide many of these benefits like resource adequacy. They can lower bills for customers. They can provide reliability services to grids that are facing extreme weather challenges or heat waves. They can provide infrastructure relief if there's a lot of expensive transmission and distribution upgrades that need to come online. They can help buy utilities time to actually space out those investments that are still very much needed, but give them the flexibility to do them in time that makes sense for their planning processes and not have to do it all at once. So a lot of these benefits that VPPs can unlock. And we saw the need for an organization, the Virtual Power Plant Partnership, to focus directly on scaling this resource for the grid. So a little bit about VP3. VP3 is an initiative based within RMI, And we launched in January of last year to address key barriers and drive VPP market growth. And our mission is to catalyze industry and change the necessary policies, regulations, and market rules for VPPs to scale in ways that benefit communities and society. And so this is a consortium of about 25 different energy, technology, and service providers. You can see our full list of membership here. And you'll see that a lot of these companies represent quite a large market share of the virtual power plant space. So in developing these principles, they were developed by the Regulatory and Policy Working Group that all of these companies participate in and that I lead. And the goal here is to share best practices. These are all lessons learned based on their direct experiences in creating and standing up and delivering these virtual power plant programs across the country. And so while this doesn't necessarily represent the individual views of each and every organization, it does represent the consensus view of these organizations that have been working in the space for a long time. So before we get into the depths of the principles themselves, regulation and policy, why did we focus in this sphere for virtual power plants? And what was the process like to get to this consensus view? We spent quite a few months putting these together. Not every company on that list has the same business model. Not every company on that list approaches the same vertical of the virtual power plant problem. Some people focus on commercial industrial customers. Some focus on residential customers. Some are battery providers. Some focus more on solar installations. So we wanted to attack the problem from all angles and come to a conclusion of where are shared pain points and what do we recommend for a path forward and what are some examples of where this has been done well. So I want everyone to understand these are best practices being shared. I think that is the main goal of putting this document together is there's a lot of different ways that virtual power plants can work. There's a lot of different ways that they look. There's a lot of different ways that they've been designed. And so we're here to try to simplify and demystify that as well. And the goal today is to empower regulators and policymakers to understand how VPPs can be leveraged to achieve affordability, reliability, and decarbonization outcomes for the grid. So this will be a broad overview. There are 17 principles. I thought it would be useful to give a broad overview so you can see what might be in this document. And then I'm going to go through some really specific examples to try to make it more digestible. So these are the policy principles to enable virtual power plants. We separated them into 5 different categories, which are the main enablers for VPPs. First off is the distributed energy resource asset base. In order to have virtual power plants in the first place, you need to advance policies to expand beneficial DER adoption by diversity of end users. The second principle is to enable the inclusion of all distributed energy resource technologies in virtual power plants. This is a nod to programs eventually being technology agnostic. By integrating it across many different technology types like batteries and smart thermostats, you can have your programs be more integrated and have the best outcomes by building off of each other. VPP design is the next category, and it is a big one. Virtual power plants, as I mentioned, can be designed in a lot of different ways or encompass a lot of different technologies. And the principles that we stand behind here are to utilize best practices in program design. We don't want folks feeling like they need to reinvent the wheel or start from square one. We want to make sure that best practices are being shared in industry. Principle 4 is to use open communication protocols and standards. This helps the devices just talk to each other. I've had a lot of different stories of other folks in the energy industry when they're trying to do their own home upgrades. They install the things that they need to, and then the devices can't talk to each other in the end. So making sure that these protocols are open and standards are open is in everyone's best interest. Principle number 5 is to enable VPP participation in wholesale and retail markets. This will allude to the compensation section as well, but enabling participation in these different markets can increase the benefits that they're able to provide and the services that they're able to provide. Principle 6 is regularly update grid service needs to reflect the evolving grid. I've seen this in a couple examples. Revisiting requirements and operational characteristics for virtual power plant programs has been key because the grid changes every day. Every day I read a different article in Utility Dive that surprises me, and that changes the game. So making sure that you're regularly revisiting those operational characteristics and parameters is key. Finally, the seventh in VPP design is to support comprehensive utility planning and investment decisions. These may be seen as new technologies, even though they may be a little more familiar. Integrating them is important into utility planning processes, so they are part of the variables that utilities are looking at when they're performing their modeling, when they're looking at their hosting capacity maps, trying to look at what the distribution system looks like, when they're trying to do, their 10-year, 15-year plans. How can VPPs fit into this? Next, we have equitable compensation. In order to scale virtual power plants, the pathways to compensation need to be there, not only from the customer perspective, so they're incentivized to have these assets and enroll them into the programs, but also from the aggregators side for the services that they're providing, as well as just the virtual power plant's revenue itself. It needs to be able to deliver those benefits and be compensated for it and be an equal player in the markets. So principle number 8 is to fairly compensate VPPs for the services delivered so they can compete with traditional generators in the same way that they have been paid for their services. Principle 9 is to enable value stacking to maximize benefits. This is a nod to being able to participate in the utilities program, and then if there's also an organized wholesale market, being also able to participate in, for example, the independent system operator in New England, being able to participate in their capacity market and earn revenue from that as well. We'll have a couple examples on that in a sec. Principle number 10 is to support policies that value VPP contributions to resilience, reliability, and sustainability. This is highlighting the need to value non-energy benefits. We're in a world where there's other objectives that need to be valued, like the distribution system relief that it can provide, the decarbonization benefits to reduce the reliance on gas peaker plants that are emitting pollution and affecting communities, things like that. So working on that type of valuation. And then principle 11 is to uphold equitable penalties and liabilities to make sure that they're fairly competing with other resources. And the second to last category is customer experience. Principle 12 is to maintain customer choice and the operational control of their assets. A customer can choose to really be in charge of their own smart thermostat, or they could, say, yes, I would love for this third-party aggregator, or yes, I would love for my utility to control it for me to get the best bang for my buck. And I don't mind having a few degrees of freedom where I know I'll still be comfortable, but I'll let them figure it out and get me the most money for using my assets. Principle 13 is uphold customer data ownership and simplify enrollment. In order to scale virtual power plants, you need people enrolled into your programs. And when enrollment is difficult, you see attrition in customer sign up, and that really can affect the ability of virtual power plants to scale. So you really want to make sure the enrollment process is simple, and we'll talk about an example there. Principle 14 is to protect and educate customers. You need to make sure customers know what they're signing up for, know what they're authorizing, and that their data needs to be protected at all costs. And then principle 15 is to support customer participation in structuring VPP offerings through procedural equity. We want to make sure that virtual power plants are able to deliver benefits to the customers, to all customers, especially customers that need it the most. And having those stakeholder collaboration meetings where customers can voice their needs is key to ensuring an equitable energy transition. And in our final category, we have utility and system operator roles. There's a lot of stakeholders in this space to make VPPs work. So principle 16 is to encourage participation of competitive hardware and service providers. This is nods to Ted's opening remarks where innovation and technology are coming. They can help solve problems. And it's important to be able to have those hardware and service providers be able to help offer some of their services so we can all achieve shared outcomes. And then finally, principle 17 is to use open source software and make grid data available. In order to stand up these programs, in order to deliver these programs, it's very important to make sure that customer data and grid data is available to third parties that can help utilities deliver on the objectives that they want to for their customers. So making sure that that data is actually available is very key in setting up an effective virtual power plant. So I know that was a lot of information. That is the overview. If you want to dive into any of these principles, please feel free to explore the brief. The way that I'm going to help folks think about it today is we're going to digest it with a couple of frameworks. So regulators and policymakers have a set of objectives that they're trying to achieve for the grid and its customers. And there's also a set of enabling conditions for VPP liftoff. Something that's in the middle that everyone cares about are these outcomes that I've mentioned: reliability, affordability, safety, and decarbonization. And VPPs are a tool to help advance these objectives, but there are some fundamental conditions that need to be met. From the regulator or policymaker perspective, they're in charge of effective and transparent policy and want to make sure they're upholding a fair administrative process. And in order to help achieve those things, VPPs need sustainable growth, and they also need long-term commercial viability. In order to help support these outcomes, they need to make sure that they have runway to continue to operate and clarity moving forward and how they can fit into the energy system. So VPPs can't do the things you want them to do if you don't have those 5 categories that I mentioned. If you don't have a sufficient DER asset base, if VPP programs aren't designed in an intentional way, if VPP grid services aren't adequately valued or equitably compensated, if customers don't enroll, if the ecosystem of stakeholders doesn't work together. So all of these categories need to line up in order to have VPPs really be able to deliver the benefits that they are poised to for the grid. So today, the way that I can help make sense of this is I'll walk through a regulatory or policy circumstance or perspective. I'll highlight some common VPP challenges related to that circumstance. I'll outline how a principal can respond to these challenges and suggest a path forward. And I'll also cite an example of where this has been done well. So with that, let's get into some examples for each of the categories. First, let's look at deployment. So we'll have this category of the circumstance example, the related challenges, the principle, and the examples. So you may find yourself in a situation where you're ruling on the effective development of non-wires programs to address distribution system congestion. And if you're trying to consider that, some of the barriers that VPPs face in this category is VPPs need a sufficient DER asset base in order to provide those grid services. So how can you reference the policy principles to help point you in the right direction? The first principle indicates that we should advance policies to expand beneficial DER adoption by diverse end users. So, okay, what does that really mean? That means you can have tax credits and rebates. You can utilize utility upfront financing of devices, on-bill financing of devices. You can also have carve-outs and energy portfolio standards for distributed energy resources. And this is really about getting those assets into people's homes so that they can be part of the energy transition. So a couple examples of where this has been done well. Green Mountain Power, they have 2 programs. One is the Powerwall lease and one is the Bring Your Own Device program. They saw long wait lists and actually had recently lifted enrollment caps. People were really interested in joining these programs. The Powerwall lease program offered battery storage for residential customers for $55 per month or one payment of $5,500. And for the Bring Your Own Device program, that offered a $10,500 upfront incentive for customers who had that to go towards their battery. And this was a really attractive way to get assets into people's homes because in Vermont, they have a lot of really intense winters and people were having outage problems. And so customers really cared about having resilience and reliability in the face of these upcoming extreme winters. And so they saw really popular enrollments, and actually, luckily, the cap was recently lifted, as I mentioned. The second example is Rocky Mountain Power's WattSmart battery program that partners with Sonnen. They have simple upfront incentives and annual bill credits to also encourage adoption of these devices. So it's $400 per kilowatt upfront for residential customers and a $15 per kilowatt annual bill credit. And you see different types of structures of compensation. These are more focused on the upfront compensation and incentives for actually getting the devices into people's homes. Moving on to the next category, we have VPP design. So You may be outlining a high level specifications for a VPP program, or maybe you've opened a proceeding investigating program design. For example, there's a docket recently open in Colorado trying to figure out how to design the pilot that they want to have on VPPs. Related challenges that VPPs face in the bucket of design, specifications for programs can preclude VPPs either through minimum aggregation sizes or real-time telemetry requirements that are too prohibitive. And another issue is that VPP programs are, I mentioned this at the start, they can be designed to be really specific to a utility's specific needs. Everyone might want it to be a little more customizable to their territory, or you might need to integrate with a certain distributed energy resource management system platform, and it differs by utility, right? So designing these bespoke VPP programs across the US can actually lead to high implementation costs when all of the VPP programs are designed in different ways. So what's a policy principle that supports a solution? The third one harps on utilizing best practices in program design. This is what I was mentioning was important for leveraging what's worked and what hasn't. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. You can look to jurisdictions that have similar examples and success stories that might have a similar power market setup. They might be in the same ISO or RTO as you, and you can see what works for them and if it'll work for your jurisdiction as well. And it's important here for utilities and third parties to share lessons learned so that folks can learn from each other. And some examples of where this has been done well. Connected Solutions is very often cited as one of the really successful VPP programs in the US. It originated in Massachusetts, but because of its success, that has been leveraged for all 6 New England states having adoption of customer battery funding programs. So that's something where we can see based on that area, all of them are in New England. They saw how those programs were designed and then implemented them in their states. And we've seen that those types of incentives spread in that area. If you want a very comprehensive list of more case studies focused around VPP design, VP3 will actually be publishing the virtual power plant flipbook. And there's case studies of, I think, about 14 or 15 different successful VPP program designs that we want to make sure we're amplifying those best practices so folks don't feel like they need to reinvent. In our next category, we have equitable compensation. So maybe you're investigating the value of or compensation for DERs, or maybe you're investigating the cost efficacy of demand side programs and are looking at how maybe a cost benefit analysis has been done for a virtual power plant. So some challenges that VPPs face in this vein is that they're not always valued or compensated for the full suite of benefits that they can provide, including the non-energy benefits, as I mentioned earlier. And sometimes program funding can be temporary or subject to budget cuts, and that long-term runway for commercial viability that I mentioned is unclear. So a principle that supports the solution here is Principle 9, enabling value stacking to maximize benefits. Now, what do we mean by value stacking? This is the participation in both the utilities program as well as maybe the wholesale market, and you can provide grid services in both of those. You can stack those services, make sure you have clear eligibility criteria, but also have rules in place to prevent double counting. So making sure that the virtual power plants are being compensated for the grid services that they're providing in the moment and not necessarily being double counted is what we mean there. So examples of where this has been done well. I want to cite Connected Solutions again, because this is a great example of where customers can participate both in the National Grid Program and also participate in the ISO New England forward capacity market. Secondly, HECO in Hawaii, their Grid Service Purchase Agreement 2 programs, which are commonly referred to as the Power Partnership programs, they compensate value across resources. And this can include, and this gets a little technical here, but capacity build, capacity reduction, and fast frequency response, which are different types of grid services that if you're enrolled into that program, you can be compensated for all of those. So by stacking these grid services for virtual power plants, it not only opens up multiple revenue streams for VPPs, but it also therefore enables the customers to have their assets go farther and also opens up the grid to more support for the services that it needs and more resources to call on in times of needs. Next, we have customer experience. So here you might be ruling on a click-through authorization process between utilities and third-party VPP providers. So what's click-through authorization? This is where customers say I'm in my utility portal, but I want to enroll in a program that a third party is offering. I would have to click through literally in order to enable to grant that third party access to my data as a customer. So challenges that VPPs face here is that sometimes customer enrollment has attrition due to complexity. I know everyone feels this. If you click through too many times, I think with every click, people's desire to do the thing really decreases, especially when it's a topic that can be so wonky as your energy usage. You know, how much money am I really going to get for this program? Oh, there's too many clicks. I might not, whatever, I might just forget about it. Another program is that customers might not sign up for the programs, period, through this. And so you'll have attrition or you'll have a lack of enrollment. So the principle that supports the solution here is Principle 13. It's to uphold customer data ownership and simplify enrollment. And an example here is making sure enrollment is simple, secure, quick, and transparent, making sure that there's an efficient timeline for utility planning and contracting to integrate the third parties, because that can also be prohibitive, and also ensuring that enrollment could happen at the device's point of sale to reduce the amount of time spent between the customer getting this device and realizing that there's actually programs that they can enroll their devices into that can also earn them more money back. Examples of this is where this has been done well. There's quite a few. So for Excel, they have an AC rewards program, and they saw enrollment triple just in the span of one summer in 2020. They onboarded a new management system and implemented a user-friendly online enrollment process. And something as simple as customer experience, customer interface, can really increase your enrollment numbers. Second, Texas has a third party, Smart Meter Texas, which maintains all customer data with easy third-party access. So you might not necessarily even need it to live within a utility or a third party. You could also have a different party entirely manage that and just enable authorization to the parties that are interested. And then lastly, the Share My Data customer authorization process allows third parties to receive customer meter data from utilities. And in California's demand-side grid support program, option 3, data is shared from the battery inverter directly to the California Energy Commission. So it kind of bypasses this authorization process as a whole. I will note customers do authorize like that Share My Data platform at the very start, but you don't actually have to do anything else with the data. It can just go straight from your battery to the Energy Commission for reporting. And lastly, thanks for, I know this is a lot of information, so I am looking forward to the Q&A. Utility and system operator roles. You may find yourself ruling on the ability of third-party aggregators to enact contracts with utilities. So we've seen a lot of companies come up in the space. People want to partner with utilities to help serve in ways that complement each other's strengths. Some challenges that VPPs face in this is that contracts can vary greatly by jurisdiction. I've seen a lot of recent movement to standardize these distribution services contracts between utilities and third parties to kind of get towards that standardization, because the variability can make it confusing, makes the overhead really complicated. It can make implementation costs really expensive if you're reinventing the wheel with every third party for all these different offerings. So a principle that supports the solution is number 16, encourage participation of competitive hardware and service providers. And some of the services that third parties can provide to help complement the strengths of the utility is customer enrollment and support. They can do device management and dispatch. They can also provide a single settlement point for the administrator. And they also can de-risk the underperformance of across a whole fleet of resources. And they can also administer the program. So examples of where this has been done well, there are tons of examples of different utility and third-party partnerships, but I wanted to focus more on the larger granularity of, are you enabling the participation of third parties and supporting that type of innovation? So example here is last October, Missouri lifted its ban, preventing third parties from bidding demand response into wholesale markets. It was initially there, and now they've lifted the ban to enable that competition. And then an example from Canada, Ontario's independent electricity system operator. They support third-party DER participation in their wholesale markets, and they're currently exploring expanding that third-party smart meter data access to try to leverage the resources and services that each can provide. So thank you. Just want to reiterate the takeaways here. We created these principles in order to support VPPs becoming part of that toolkit. We know that it's a buzzword that's coming up a lot in industry. We know that it's, as I said, an integrated repackaging of concepts that are familiar, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make that integration more seamless, standardize some of these program designs, share these best practices so that VPPs can scale in ways and we can increase the access of the benefits to its customers and the grid. So happy to answer any questions folks have. I'll actually have my co-chair of the VP3 Regulatory and Policy Working Group join me, Angela Kent. She's a Senior Manager of Regulatory Affairs at Energy Hub, and we are happy to take any questions you have. So maybe I'll review the Q&A real quick. So I see this first question, Pam. Are there places outside the US where VPPs are used regularly? So yes, in our membership at VP3, we have companies that also have projects across the world. VP3 is specifically focusing on scaling in the US right now, but definitely leveraging best practices from other countries. So other countries that are maybe a little bit farther along in the virtual power plant experience curve is Germany, Australia, Japan, the UK has some flexibility markets as well. Angela, any other international examples to cite?
Yes, Canada. International is not my forte.
All right, thanks, Pam, for your question. So I see a question here, how a dryer and washer act as a VPP. So this is a great question. This ties into the general category of plug loads. So if you think about it, anything that you plug into your wall, depending on how your house is set up and depending on the directional capability of those devices, everything you plug in is a load and seen as demand on the grid. So depending on how that technology is set up, let's use an electric vehicle, for example. So electric vehicles originally came out to be powered just by electricity, and it was one way. So you could plug in your car, you'd be charged with electricity instead of gas. Now electric vehicles are transitioning to have bidirectional capabilities where you can actually export that power back to the grid. And so a washer or dryer, depending on how it's set up and the technology, that could also, in theory, serve as part of a virtual power plant if you have that capability to be able to send back to the grid, because in the end, it's just all electrons and they're all serving the same purpose. There's different physics-based characteristics of different assets, but in general, that's how you could think of a dryer or washer acting as a VPP. Angela, any Q&A you reviewed while I was presenting maybe that you want to touch on?
Yeah, I can I can address Steve Meyer's first question on Principle 4, which references using open communications protocols. Yes, how much traction those protocols have gained, which ones are most promising, and have large OEMs committed to allowing access to their DERs using open protocols. So I think generally speaking, number one, mostly yes. I believe that most major OEMs of like the very popular DERs utilize open communication standards. I think that one of the reasons that I like this topic is it's one thing to like select an open standard, and it's another thing to implement it. I think that there is probably, generally speaking, a broad lack of understanding in the industry of like what implementation of those communication standards entails. You're agreeing on a use, you need to agree on a use case, you need to agree on kind of a management strategy, but ultimately you need to be able to communicate different information between all of the parties involved in enabling a VPP, depending on the use case and the terms of the program. And so even like for OpenADR, for instance, which is a long-standing open communication standard, OpenADR can't be like exactly implemented in the exact same way for every use case and every device. And so there is, a lot of ongoing work to ensure that those standards are able to support the variety of use cases that are out there. But I think it's just important to also like set that expectation with regulators that even when OEMs do leverage those standards, implementation is not like click on, click off, yes, no. And I think that everyone needs to kind of be aware of that so that we don't, falsely set regulator expectations. And so that we just have like a general understanding of the complexity that is involved in lots of data flowing through a lot of different parties.
Thanks, Angela.
I can take Mary Spurgeon's question, Avery, unless you, okay.
Go for it.
So Mary asks, how do we get policymakers to value solutions like VPPs when IOUs are incentivized to prefer CapEx investments, not just generation, but also in grid enhancements, even if VPPs could be the lowest cost solution? That's a great question. I mean, I think that's a question that everyone has. First thing that comes to mind, because it's one of my favorite topics, is performance-based rate making, changing the ways that we incentivize utilities to do things. Obviously, that's like a large undertaking, but I think it's important conceptually and something that we need to continue to explore. Everyone always talks about that. There's also the use of like lost revenue cost recovery, like, tools that were implemented when energy efficiency portfolios first came to light that would make it so that the utility wasn't, let's say, disincentivized to implement a measure because of lost revenue. And I think that another really important aspect of this can be bringing the frameworks that we use to evaluate non-wires alternatives into other portfolio planning processes. Like, generally speaking, in NWA evaluations, utilities have to evaluate and kind of like submit for review a variety of options, including those that leverage DERs to resolve certain problems. And I think there are elements of those processes that can be brought into DSM portfolio planning or whatever your jurisdiction utilizes, to ensure that, essentially requiring that these solutions are evaluated when you're seeking to address a need. And so there are a variety of tools that can be utilized, and whether or not utility incentivization is a part of that is kind of a philosophical choice.
Yeah, and Angela, I may have missed it. Did you mention performance-based rate making for this?
Yeah, that's the first thing I said, because
right.
I could talk about that all day.
Yeah, definitely. I want to take Steve Myers' question here on principle number 8. So how do we fairly compensate end users to allow their distributed energy resources to be dispatched by an aggregator, utility, or independent system operator? Incentives do not seem sufficient. If somebody spent $10,000 to $20,000 on a battery system, they probably need more than $100 rebate to give up control. What do we know about how the price elasticity compelling end users to participate? This is a great question and also an extremely hot topic in industry right now. So I went into depth on some of the incentive structures that are upfront for actually incentivizing the deployment of the DER itself. But something that is also part of the larger compensation package, similar to a bonus and a salary in a job, I'd say the upfront payment is like the bonus. And then you can have the salary, which is paying for performance. So some of the compensation structures for ongoing performance payments, you can have, customers be directly compensated for their performance in an event. You can have time varying or dynamic rates where maybe a customer enrolls their asset into that varying rate where it'll be dispatched based on, when it makes financial sense to actually dispatch it and not hold on to that battery life. Or you can also have, the performance payments can either be like at the end of a season, it could be by the event, it could be at the end of the year, but that ongoing payment for actual participation can really influence customers. It depends on the customer, like how much they want to be part of that decision versus set it and forget it is a term that's used a lot in the industry. Like they may authorize the use of their asset during specific times and just let the third party or utility just take care of it. But I think if you have those performance-based payments, you will further incentivize participation beyond just the upfront incentive. Because like you mentioned, if you're just getting a lump sum payment to help go towards your battery, for some people that might not convince them enough to do it. But if you integrate those performance payments, that could help reduce their ongoing energy burden and bills.
All right, I will briefly address this question that just came in about how states address dual participation when RTOs or utilities won't or are reluctant to do so. Not going to give a perfect answer because I think that like the answer to this question is just incredibly context specific. But I do think that a core element of this is it's going to be really, really hard to assess and address dual participation without the use of very granular like device level data. Essentially, if you want to be able to understand whether a customer is being double compensated or where their contributions are going, you need to understand like what their device is doing with a lot of temporal granularity. So I think that a first step that all like regulators can take on this path is just making sure that that device level data can be utilized for evaluation and like measurement, evaluation, and verification and things like that, because you need that kind of like minutely 15-minute interval data to begin to address those questions. And then to Amit's question, is there a risk of VPPs overloading local distribution grid constraints? And has that been addressed adequately by any kind of market design? I think it's a really interesting question because there are like two perspectives on DERs. One of them is like panacea solution to a lot of grid problems, and the other one is like grid problem. Like, what are these things doing? What kind of impact are they going to have? And I think that the purpose of aggregating these resources and orchestrating their behavior is to leverage the benefits and minimize the potential disadvantages of just like unmanaged growth of devices that may have negative impacts on the distribution grid. Generally speaking, I feel like most DERs up until today, where they do have options for participation, they're really being used to kind of like reduce overall system peaks. And there has been, but the high level use case hasn't been like management of like granular locational distribution grid conditions. But I think that that is increasingly happening. Like everyone in the ecosystem, utilities, regulators, aggregators, like OEMs gaining a better understanding of the fact that that is a really poor part of how they need to be leveraged. And so I would say that increasingly policies and programs account for that, and the DERs are being increasingly managed to address those constraints.
Awesome. Thanks, Angela. I'll take a couple questions here. There's a question from Kim Worsencroft. So, are there efforts to create new building guidelines to include the ability or require to participate in a VPP? And if so, what would these guidelines potentially look like? So, interesting question because this hits on grid interactive efficient buildings, which is a category of DER, I guess, in a way, asset types that can fall in virtual power plants. So, grid interactive efficient buildings is where the building as a whole can optimize its energy usage and generation, and also, provide services back to the grid. This is GEBS is what people call it for short. That's not my specialty, but there are many working groups that are focusing specifically on grid interactive efficient buildings. I'm not personally familiar with building guidelines to include that. I think an example that comes to mind is there's this community. It's an 86 home community in Florida. I'm blanking on the name, but they built an 86 home community with solar and battery and the ability to connect to the grid and be in a VPP. So in a way, you can develop new communities to have those technologies and capabilities in the homes that people are already buying. It's the first LEED net zero community in the US. I think it's Hunters Point. And in that way, you're kind of implicitly requiring that people participate. I don't think you like buy the house and like it may be in the conditions or the contract that you sign, but that's another way where you just have your new build can include those technologies, and then therefore people will kind of be nudged to participate and give, energy to their neighbors depending on how it's set up. Second question I wanted to address is how does energy efficiency fit into the whole VPP ecosystem? Very excited to answer this as RMI. So one of RMI's core ethi, I'm gonna leave that there, is looking at the demand side first. So if you're looking at what you need in the end to actually serve that end use or that end use customer, if you implement energy efficiency measures first, then you will reduce the need for what you need to build upstream. This gets a little complicated when you have these demand side resources, but we always say demand side first. So you want to implement energy efficiency in your home to reduce, you can caulk your windows, you can increase your insulation so that the load that your house actually has is lower. And that is a core part of the VPP ecosystem, because then you build on the demand response capabilities, the demand flexibility, but your demand itself has shrunk. So hopefully that helps answer that question. Angela, want to take the New England?
Yeah. So George asks that he says that New England is trying to think about increased deployment of VPPs and DERs to address winter resource adequacy issues. Are there any issues that you identified that are unique to cold/winter weather for increasing use of these resources? I'm going to caveat by saying this is not even remotely a comprehensive answer, but I think the two things that jump out to me are, number one, there are several heating electrification appliances that are extremely efficient, which is awesome, but that also makes them less optimal candidates for, let's say, like, they can't provide enormous amounts of load reduction because they're so efficient. So it's almost, this is not across the board, but I think that there is some kind of like research and level setting that needs to be done to kind of like familiarize the industry and regulators with like achievable load reduction potential from a lot of those electrified heating resources. And I'm not just talking about HVAC, I'm talking about like water, et cetera. And then the other thing that jumps out to me about this is that generally speaking, those conversations tend to go hand in hand with building decarbonization, kind of like fuel transition, gas transition. And so in places where their electric utilities and gas utilities are separate and have overlapping territories, there are a lot of questions about who has responsibility for orchestrating these things, like, how are customers compensated? And so there's also a lot of thinking that needs to be done on that front when electric and gas utilities have overlapping jurisdictions. And that's just something that's jumped out to me as well.
Thanks, Angela. I do see someone actually added into the Q&A. So there's a Grid Interactive Efficient Building Working Group. There are no guidelines yet, but various communities, including Connected Communities projects, Washington and Oregon, have a requirement that new electric water heaters have grid communication capability. So thank you, Rodney, for that info. No clear guidelines yet, but it sounds like there's starting to be some inklings. So appreciate that. There's another question here. Do you have a list of working groups across these principles that could be shared? Great question and great idea. That currently doesn't exist, but I'm happy to try to put a little bit of that together, and maybe in the follow-up email, I can include some of the working groups that I know exist. And then I think we have time for just one wrap-up question, but Angela, I am curious first to your answer of the maybe Leslie's question from 1143, and then we can wrap up with the biggest misconception. You're on mute.
Yeah, how are current VPP companies able to ensure the participation of DERs in the loads they aggregate, and what are the actual conditions that the DER owners agree to? So number one, I would say current VPP companies mostly aggregate DERs. Like you can in some ways think of those terms as they're almost synonymous, but essentially a VPP company, by my understanding, is a company that aggregates DERs. So I think that if the question is how do you ensure their participation, number one, you make it really easy for people to participate. You make it as like simple and accessible as possible for people to hear about the program and sign up for it. You also make sure that incentives are aligned with customer retention. And fortunately, we have a lot of data on that, but I think that's honestly in early phases, trial and error. You see what kind of incentive encourages retention. And then what are the conditions that the DER owners agree to? In my experience, it tends to be your resource. If you agree to this, your resource is going to be leveraged for these purposes. Customer has an idea of when they can do that, how often that will happen. And then I think a core tenet of this is that the customer always retains total control over their resource. So I think that's another one of the ways that you keep people in the program, is you make sure they know you are the kind of like end decision maker, and you're going to be able to maintain comfort in your home, et cetera, like regardless of the terms of the program.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Angela. We have time for one final exit question. So I'll ask you, and then I'll end with my answer and wrap us. So We have a question here. What's the biggest misconception on VPPs that needs to be addressed?
I think the biggest misconception is that they're not real or that they're not reliable. And I'm sure everyone here could provide years and years of data and anecdotes to kind of refute that. But I think the biggest the best way to demonstrate that is just to point at the fact that like we've had VPPs in their use cases and their abilities and the way and the devices that they're made up of are growing and changing. But like we've had thermostat programs or like for a long time, and they are able to provide like a lot of load relief. And so there are new capabilities, but this isn't a brand new concept, and they've been providing reliability for a long time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly where I was going to. Like the virtual part of the virtual power plant makes it seem fake. Okay, what virtual services are you providing? I've heard some people tend towards the term distributed power plant to help like really illustrate what it is. But I think in terms of the misconception, yeah, there's a strong misconception that VPPs aren't reliable. And as Angela said, like that's just not true. In September 2022, for those who live in California, we had that 9-day heat dome, and virtual power plants across the state toggled people's devices within their customer comfort parameters. And the grid was on the verge of blacking out for many days, and it never did. And the independent system operator, KaiSo, actually tweeted, "Thank you, California," and attributed like customer participation to be part of the reason why it didn't black out. So we've seen examples time and time again of where VPPs have shown up and have been reliable. And as we deploy more and more assets and are able to dispatch them more, we'll have the law of averages and it'll smooth things out even more and just create it. All it will do is increase the reliability moving forward. So, all right. Thanks, folks. We will be sending a follow-up email with resources from this. Really appreciated the great Q&A. And if you have any questions, let us know, and we're always available. So thank you, folks, and onward VPPs.